The first American fighter slammed into the treetops, so low its propeller shredded leaves before the German sentry even heard the engine scream. That moment, violent, sudden, and utterly unexpected, marked the instant the rules of air combat over Europe began to change. Until then, the sky had belonged to altitude. Height meant safety. Height meant vision. Height meant control. American fighter pilots had been trained from their first day to climb, reach the sun, dominate the air, and strike downward like hawks. That was doctrine. That was gospel. But by late 1943, doctrine was getting pilots killed. The Luftwaffe had learned the American playbook. They knew the bomber streams would arrive high and proud, silver formations glittering in the sun. They knew the escorts would be above them, waiting to pounce. German radar, flak batteries, and interceptors had been tuned to that expectation. So the Americans went lower. Much lower. Captain Jack Mercer felt the earth rushing beneath him as his P-47 Thunderbolt tore across the French countryside at less than 100 feet. Farmhouses blurred. Church steeples flashed past his canopy. A line of poplar trees whipped by so close he instinctively hunched, as if branches could pierce the glass. This wasn't flying. This was survival. Mercer's hands were slick inside his gloves. His jaw ached from clenching. Every instinct screamed that this was madness. One mistake, one unseen wire, one nervous twitch of the stick, and he would be vaporized against the ground. But above him was death. Just months earlier, Mercer had lost 2 friends over Bremen. Shot down while flying by the book. High escort. Perfect formation. Predictable routes. German fighters had come screaming out of the sun, exactly where intelligence said they wouldn't be. The funerals were brief. The explanations are shorter. So when word filtered through the squadrons, quietly, unofficially, that some pilots were experimenting with ultra-low approaches, men listened. And some followed. The first missions weren't planned. They were reactions. Desperation tactics. Pilots diving beneath flak, skimming rivers, hiding behind hills simply to make it home alive. But something unexpected happened. They started seeing things. Convoys that didn't know they were there. Airfields with fighters parked wing to wing. Trains rolling openly, smoke puffing confidently into clear skies. The Germans weren't watching the ground. They were watching the sky. Mercer's radio crackled. Blue 2, keep it tight. Lieutenant Sam Keller slid in beside him, his wingtip nearly brushing Mercer's. They were flying so low Keller could see chickens scattering from a dirt road below. Ahead, the treeline broke. And there it was. A Luftwaffe forward strip, camouflaged, quiet, utterly unprepared. Mercer didn't think. He pushed the throttle forward and opened fire. By the time German anti-aircraft crews realized what was happening, the Americans were already gone, leaving burning fighters, shattered fuel drums, and stunned silence behind them. Reports flooded Luftwaffe command that night. Confused. Contradictory. Pilots insisted American fighters had come out of the trees. Ground crews swore they heard engines before seeing anything at all. At first, German officers dismissed it. Fighter aircraft didn't fly that low. Not intentionally. But the reports didn't stop. In fact, they multiplied. American fighters began appearing where radar didn't see them. Approaching from valleys, rivers, forest gaps. Entire squadrons emerging beneath the horizon line, striking targets that had been considered safe by virtue of being unimportant. Treetop flying was turning the landscape into camouflage. For the pilots, it was hell. Flying that low meant no margin. Birds became threats. Power lines were invisible killers. Even small arms fire, rifles, machine guns, suddenly mattered. One lucky shot could shatter an oil line or puncture a coolant system. Mercer watched Keller nearly die when a burst from a German truck stitched across his wing. Keller limped home with fuel spraying behind him like a comet's tail. They landed shaken, pale, quiet, but alive. Briefings changed. Slowly. Quietly. Official doctrine still emphasized altitude, but commanders who paid attention began to notice a pattern. Pilots who flew low came back more often. And they brought intelligence. Rail lines. Troop movements. Hidden depots. Things bombers never saw from 20,000 feet. Treetop pilots became scouts, hunters, and assassins rolled into one. The Germans responded the only way they could, by lowering their guns. Flak batteries were dragged closer to the front. Machine gun nests were repositioned. Soldiers were ordered to fire at anything that moved. But the Luftwaffe faced a problem they hadn't planned for. You couldn't guard everything. And you couldn't predict where the Americans would rise next. One morning, Mercer's group was ordered to escort bombers toward Leipzig. Halfway there, clouds thickened, visibility collapsed, and flak began bursting ahead. "Brake and go low," the lead ordered. They dropped. Instantly the world transformed. The roar of engines echoed off hillsides. Trees whipped past. The bombers disappeared above, swallowed by gray. Mercer felt something strange. Relief. Down here, at least, the enemy couldn't dive on him from above. Down here, surprise belonged to the Americans. They emerged near a rail junction just as a German troop train rolled through, engines steaming, soldiers lounging openly atop cars. Mercer lined up the shot. The first pass tore the locomotive apart. The second pass sent men scattering. By the third, there was nothing left to shoot. When Mercer pulled up and climbed away, his aircraft shuddered with hits. Holes peppered the fuselage. A warning light blinked angrily. But he was still flying. Back at base, intelligence officers swarmed them. Questions. Maps. Pencils scratching furiously. Treetop flying wasn't just a tactic anymore. It was changing the war on the ground. German fighter aces began dying without ever seeing their enemy. One moment, they were climbing to intercept bombers at altitude. The next, their airfields were erupting in fire. Fuel trucks exploding, parked aircraft shredded by cannon fire, pilots sprinting for cover as American fighters screamed past at impossible angles. The Luftwaffe had built its confidence on control of the vertical. In anticipation. On order. Treetop flying destroyed all three. Radar couldn't see below the curvature of the earth. Spotters couldn't track what flashed past hedgerows at 400 miles an hour. Commanders couldn't reposition fighters fast enough to respond. The Americans were no longer reacting. They were dictating. Mercer noticed the change in German behavior first through absence. Roads once busy now lay empty during daylight. Trains moved only at night. Aircraft were dispersed, hidden under trees, dragged into barns. Fear had moved downward. The ground itself had become dangerous. During one mission over Belgium, Mercer and Keller spotted a convoy halted beneath a bridge. Vehicles packed tight, crews huddled nervously. "Let's remind them," Keller said. They came in from opposite sides, low enough to see faces. Mercer fired a single burst, not to destroy, but to warn. The convoy erupted in panic. That night, Mercer wrote in his journal, something he rarely did. "We're not just fighting pilots anymore. We're fighting habits." Losses mounted on both sides. American squadrons paid dearly for the tactic. Many pilots never saw what killed them. An unseen cable, a hill crest misjudged, a burst from a hidden gun. But the balance had shifted. Treetop flying forced the Luftwaffe into a defensive crouch. Fighters burned fuel scrambling for threats that vanished as quickly as they appeared. German pilots complained they were always too late, always reacting to ghosts. By early 1944, Allied planners took notice. The tactic was folded into pre-invasion strategy. Low-level interdiction. Armed reconnaissance. Constant pressure. Mercer flew on D-Day morning, skimming beaches still choked with smoke. He saw men fighting below, tiny and brave, and knew, without doubt, that the madness of flying so low had helped clear their path. The sky would always be dangerous. But now, so was the ground. And the Luftwaffe would never recover from that shock. By the spring of 1944, treetop flying was no longer whispered about in barracks or scribbled cautiously into private journals. It was written carefully, deliberately, into mission briefings. Maps were now marked not just with targets, but with terrain. Rivers became highways. Valleys became corridors. Forest lines became shields. American fighter pilots were being taught not just how to fly through the sky, but how to use the earth itself as cover. Captain Jack Mercer sat through the briefing with his helmet resting on his knee, listening as an intelligence officer traced a finger along a French river valley. "You'll stay below the ridgeline until this bend," the officer said. "German radar coverage drops out here. If you climb early, they'll see you." Mercer exchanged a glance with Sam Keller. 6 months earlier, this would have sounded insane. Now it sounded precise. The room was quiet, not with fear, but with concentration. These men understood the risk. They also understood the reward. Flying low had turned the Luftwaffe's greatest strength, its organization, into a weakness. German pilots were trained to fight other pilots, not shadows streaking past barns and treelines. Still, the cost was real. One squadron lost 3 men in a single afternoon, when weather dropped unexpectedly and hills appeared too late. Another lost a veteran pilot to a power line strung across a river, something no map could ever warn you about. Every mission felt like borrowing time. Mercer felt it most clearly the day Keller didn't answer his radio. They had come in low over a rail junction, flak snapping around them like angry insects. Mercer pulled up hard after his pass, heart pounding, scanning for Keller's thunderbolt. Nothing. Just smoke rising from behind a stand of trees. Mercer circled once, then again, knowing what he'd find and hating himself for hoping he wouldn't. He never saw the wreck. They told him later Keller had clipped a rise he couldn't see in time. Instant. That night, Mercer sat alone on his cot, helmet in his lap, hands shaking. He thought of how low they flew now. How close everything was. How thin the line had become. Is it worth it? He wondered. The answer came the next morning. A ground commander visited the airfield, mud still on his boots, exhaustion etched deep into his face. He shook Mercer's hand hard. "Your boys kept the armor from reaching us yesterday," he said. "We saw your planes. They came in so low we could see the markings." Mercer nodded, unable to speak. "By the way, if you're clinging to this moment with me, make sure to hit subscribe, more weights just ahead." And the war surged forward. By the time Allied forces pushed inland after Normandy, the Luftwaffe was no longer hunting. It was hiding. German pilots complained bitterly in reports that American fighters were everywhere and nowhere. Fuel shortages worsened as airfields were attacked before aircraft could even take off. Veteran aces found themselves scrambling in panic as cannon fire ripped through dispersal areas. Treetop flying had turned fighters into raiders. Mercer's missions blurred together, roads, bridges, columns of armor half concealed under netting that fooled no one at 50 feet. The work was relentless. There was no glory in it. No formations glittering against the sun. Just sudden violence and immediate escape. German ground troops began firing at everything. Nervous soldiers shot at birds. At reflections. At echoes. Ammunition vanished in fear-driven bursts. And still the Americans came. On one mission near the German border, Mercer's flight stumbled upon a Luftwaffe training field. Young pilots, barely out of instruction, preparing aircraft for practice flights. They never got airborne. Mercer saw one German instructor running across the field, arms waving, trying to warn his students. The image haunted him, not because of pity, but because it showed how unprepared the enemy had become. The Luftwaffe had been built to dominate the sky. It had no answer for the ground betraying it. Late in 1944, German command officially acknowledged the threat, ordering increased low-level defenses and dispersal. But it was too late. They no longer had the fuel, the pilots, or the time to adapt. The shock had already broken them. Mercer noticed fewer intercepts. Fewer dogfights. The sky above 20,000 feet felt empty now, irrelevant. The war was being decided lower. Much lower. Victory did not come clean. For every successful mission, another pilot failed to return. The squadron roster grew thinner. New faces arrived, young, eager, terrified. Mercer saw himself in them and hated the mirror. He taught them how to fly low, how to read shadows, how to sense terrain instead of trusting instruments. "You don't fly the plane," he told one replacement. "You dance with the ground." Some learned. Some didn't live long enough to. On a bitter January morning, Mercer's engine coughed during a run-in over Germany. He felt the vibration immediately, felt the aircraft losing confidence. He stayed low anyway. Climbing meant flak. Staying low meant maybe. He limped home with smoke pouring from his cowling, landing hard, brakes screaming. Mechanics swarmed the plane, shaking their heads. That night, Mercer finally allowed himself to imagine not surviving this war. He wasn't afraid of death anymore. He was afraid of forgetting. Forgetting Keller's laugh. Forgetting the way the countryside rushed beneath him. Forgetting why they'd risked everything flying where planes were never meant to be. When the war ended, historians focused upward. Bombers. Aces. Altitude. Treetop flying didn't fit the myth. It was too chaotic. Too close. Too dangerous to romanticize. But the numbers told the truth. Supply lines shattered. Ground forces stalled. Air superiority is broken not by duels, but by fear. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the moment American pilots abandoned the safety of height and embraced the danger below. Years later, Mercer stood at a quiet airfield, watching a restored P-47 lift gently into the sky. It climbed smoothly, confidently, exactly as it had been designed to do. He smiled faintly. They had flown it wrong. And by doing so, they had shocked an enemy who never imagined the ground itself could become a weapon. Some wars are won by reaching higher. This one was won by daring to fly lower than anyone thought possible.